There's been a steep decline in the trust that people feel in institutions in most developed countries. If you look at the polling on the United States, very few institutions have not seen a marked decline in trust over a 30 to 40 year time period, because we have Gallup data in the US going back to the 1970s. The decline in trust in Congress is very striking. I mean, it's been down in the single digits at some points in recent years. But you've also seen a decline in trust in the Supreme Court, and not surprisingly, perhaps the presidency, but that certainly predates Donald Trump. The military is an exception in the American case. Trust has actually risen in the military relative to the 1970s. Perhaps that's not surprising, because the 70s was the time of Vietnam. There's still high levels of trust in the police. But most institutions have experienced a significant decline in trust. And amongst the worst non-political institutions in these terms are the banks. Journalists and the banks kind of vie to be bottom of the trust league table. Now, is this because people have, for whatever reason, withdrawn their trust capriciously? No, it's because the banks and indeed the media in most developed countries have lost people's trust by the way they've acted. I'm not going to get into the details of the Australian banks, but let's look at the biggest banks in the world, and the ones that in many ways were the epicenter of the financial crisis, the American banks. They had behaved in a range of ways that were not illegal. They were compliant with regulation, or at least the regulators tolerated them, but the consequences for ordinary people were catastrophic. Not just because of the mis-selling of financial products that were bad, but because the whole thing turned into a massive systemic crisis that nearly blew up the world economy the way the 1929 crash did. We had a very close shave. I mean, you kind of forgotten it now, but there nearly was a Great Depression because of the way the banks were run. And I wrote a book about this, The Ascent of Money, and spent some time thinking about what had happened. And one of the striking features, and this goes to your question, John, about the banks, is that they were actually the most regulated entities in the US financial system on the eve of the crisis. People had worried that hedge funds would cause the next financial crisis, or the unregulated derivatives markets. No, it was the highly regulated banks, which a whole bunch of regulators were supposed to be watching over. And it hit me as I was writing The Ascent of Money that the culture of banking had fundamentally changed over the 20 or so years before the financial crisis, from a culture which was based on informal understandings and relatively light supervision, in which you tried to do the right thing, to a culture in which you simply complied with the regulation. Are we compliant is a very different question from are we doing the right thing? I read a biography of a man named Sigmund Warburg, a really unusual figure in financial history, because he didn't really mean to be a banker. He was really a scholar intellectual who'd become a banker because of the way the Nazis had forced him from his German homeland. And he started over in London, and he built a financial business, S.G. Warburg, that was fundamentally based on his own sense of integrity. And Warburg was the kind of person who, if he didn't like the look of somebody, wouldn't do business with them no matter how much money they had. Robert Maxwell walks into Warburg's and walks out again, and Warburg says, we will have nothing to do with that man. That scene in which a moral judgment is made about a potential relationship, that kind of scene had simply ceased to happen on Wall Street by 2006-07. The only question was, are we compliant? Can we do this? Can we do this? Is this okay? And that's a completely different mindset from the one that Warburg saw as central to a successful functioning financial order. The bankers in America, and I think this was true perhaps even more true in Britain, lost the trust of people for a reason, and they have to win it back. And they're not going to win it back in a hurry, any more than the media companies who've peddled fake news, misrepresented stories, opted for sensation over fact, any more than those media companies are going to win back trust. So let's not blame ordinary people for losing trust, whether it's in the US Congress or banks. They have every reason to have lost trust, and the institutions have got to win it back, and that's not going to happen overnight.